Hello, everybody. I am delighted and unbelievably honored to receive this distinguished fellowship. And I'm just really sorry that I can't be in Canada in person to say thank you. I was never fortunate enough to meet John McArthur, though I am one of the many beneficiaries of his leadership of Harvard Business School. When I was a graduate student at the Kennedy School, I took several classes at the buzzing business school across the river, and I'm sure they made my Harvard experience all the richer. John McArthur clearly had an extraordinary ability to lead and to bring people together. As you just heard Michael Bloomberg say in that video, John believed the best deals leave both sides better off. In too many contexts today, that attribute seems to be in short supply, particularly in the area that I want to talk about, the relations between the United States and China. It's no exaggeration to say that this relationship will define the coming decades. When tomorrow's history books are written about the early 21st century, our era, I think, will be seen as one of several profound, simultaneous transformations. And I generally think that we are in the midst of 4 such transformations. The first is the digital revolution, the technological transformation from computers to mobile to the internet to big data and AI that is transforming and will transform our lives and economies, I think, more profoundly than the Industrial Revolution. The second great shift of the early 21st century is the climate crisis, whose effects are becoming ever more clearer and the combating of which will require a profound change from economies driven by fossil fuels to a carbon-neutral world. The third big shift is the remaking of our societies, of our social contract, the reshaping of our tax systems and our welfare systems as our economies go digital and our populations age. And the fourth, and arguably the most urgent, is the rise of China and the reshaping of the global geopolitical order that's leading to. All these 4 shifts are high stakes. They're all interlinked. The way that US-Chinese relations evolve will determine how effectively we tackle climate change. It'll influence the nature of the technological revolution, what our digital 21st century world looks like. It'll determine what kind of a global economy we have. And unfortunately, in extremis, it will determine whether we face potentially catastrophic conflict. It's also a relationship that has changed and deteriorated remarkably quickly. For much of the early 21st century, the guiding spirit of US-China relations was mutual benefit from integration. China's entry into the World Trade Organization was predicated on the idea that there would be economic gains to both sides from bringing the world's most populous country into the global trading system. Amongst more optimistic people in the West, there was also the hope that China's integration would eventually lead to greater political liberalization. Within China, the focus was on improving living standards, on harnessing global trade to reduce poverty and hasten development. I remember when I visited China as a journalist in the mid-2000s, 2006, 2007, 2008, being struck not just by the phenomenal pace of growth, but the ostentatious modesty of Chinese policymakers. China might be big and growing quickly, they would make clear, but it was a developing country with big challenges, much to learn, and a long way to go. That world, a world in which there was talk of mutual gain and the benefits of integration, is no more. China is now unabashed about its own rise and the decline of the West. In 2017, Xi Jinping made clear that China was, quote, moving to the global center stage. Now he says, quote, the East is rising and the West is declining. He said recently, quote, the United States is the biggest threat to our country's development and security. In American eyes, China has gone from being a partner who it hoped would become a responsible stakeholder in the global trading system to a strategic and systemic rival. President Biden said at the G7 summit this week that America was in a contest with autocratic governments around the world as to whether or not democracies can compete with them in the 21st century, in a changing 21st century. So the first question has to be, what happened? Because key to analyzing where the US-China relationship is going is how it got here. How did things deteriorate so quickly? And let's start with what happened in China. I think the turning point, or a turning point, was the 2008 financial crisis. It bolstered China's role. It was China's huge stimulus, remember, that propped up the global economy in 2010. And it also dramatically dented American economic credibility and the reputation of the Western market model in the eyes of many in the emerging world. If the home of red-blooded capitalism could mess up so badly, perhaps the market economy wasn't so great. But more important was the arrival of Xi Jinping as China's leader. He aggressively asserted control over the Communist Party, and he strengthened party control over the economy and society. And he has skillfully used a populist nationalist narrative, appealing to China's rightful pride in their achievements and China's return to greatness as a rationale for this strengthening of authoritarianism. He has fused China's economic success with Communist Party control in an increasingly anti-Western ideology. In this narrative, the Western values of liberal democracy are not just ineffective and flabby, they are a cynical ploy to keep China down. I think the third element is the nature of the tech revolution we're currently in. Not only did China realize that leadership in critical technologies from quantum computing to AI would accelerate its economic progress, it has also become clear that they would reinforce the authoritarian system, provided they were tightly controlled. With ubiquitous digital surveillance, censorship, and AI-driven monitoring, China is creating the beginnings of a panopticon state, using digital technology as a mechanism for social control. And many of these are winner-takes-all technologies. Whoever controls 5G shapes the future of the digital revolution. AI brings classic network effects. The more data you have, the more effective your algorithms. China has tons of data, a digitally savvy population of over 1 billion people, and scant concern for privacy. And all of this behind its great firewall. It's not just catching up, but it is leading and shaping many of the tech innovations of the 21st century. And it is reinforcing authoritarian control at the same time. If we turn to the US, we see an equally abrupt change in the consensus view of China in the middle of the last decade, say between 2014 and 2016, for many similar reasons. In the aftermath of the financial crisis, popular opinion turned against trade and globalization. Trade, especially trade with China, was seen as responsible for the hollowing out of the American middle class. It led to a populist backlash and anti-trade backlash on both sides of the political aisle. At the same time, big business grew disillusioned with what it saw as Chinese stealing of secrets, ignoring the rules of the WTO. Military types had rising concerns about China's aggressive nationalistic moves, especially the expansion of man-made militarized islands in the South China Sea. So remarkably quickly, the mood in the US went from seeing China as a partner to a strategic competitor. And all this means that I think whoever had won the 2016 election, American policy would have changed. But the fact that it changed so dramatically was thanks to Donald Trump's wrecking ball approach. He launched a trade war, a barrage of sanctions from Huawei to TikTok. American policy became unpredictable, punitive, and arbitrary. Mr. Trump had no respect for the multilateral system, which the US had created and pledged to uphold. He cared little about human rights and told President Xi as much. His view was simply that America needed a better deal. And at last, America had a president who was as cynical as many Chinese had always thought the Americans might be, a president who lashed out with no respect for the rules. This reinforced the growing sense in China that America is just a sore loser, simply trying to keep China down. And it also reinforced President Xi's agenda for pushing for primacy in high technology. Because if China couldn't rely on a globalized integrated system, if it was going to risk being a victim to sudden arbitrary American sanctions, it needed to produce cutting-edge technology from chips to AI itself. So the result, remarkably quickly, is a situation where neither side trusts the other. Worse, as my colleague David Rennie, who's our bureau chief in Beijing, has put it, it's a situation where there is no common definition of success. America's best case is that China stumbles and becomes less arrogant. China's best case is that America realizes it's lost its top dog status and stops resisting China's rise. There's no commonality between those views. The pandemic has dramatically worsened the finger-pointing. In China, it reinforced the ideas that democracies were failing. Chinese were genuinely shocked by America's inability to control the pandemic. And in America, and indeed in other countries in the West, it reinforced an ugly anti-Chinese sentiment. The Biden administration has lowered the temperature. Gone, I think, is the arbitrary, unpredictable behavior. Instead, this administration is in the midst of a methodical, comprehensive review of China policy. There's been a clearer focus on human rights, blunter criticism of and sanctions on China's behavior in Xinjiang. But broadly, as Mr. Biden has said, quote, I'm not looking for conflict. But at the same time, the underlying American position, I think, is the same. There's been no change on tariffs, no dismantling of the broader regime of sanctions and controls. And more fundamentally, the Biden team share the mistrust and skepticism of China that the Trump hawks had. The underlying philosophy of the Biden administration's trade policy, especially its Buy America stance, frankly, is not all that different from America First. It just uses nicer words and is less unpredictable. The focus is on the American worker at home, not on the global trading system. All of which means, I think, that we are in a grim world of dueling superpowers. It's become fashionable, I'm sure you've all heard it, to talk of the Thucydides trap, a term popularized by Graham Allison at Harvard, to describe the tendency towards conflict when an emerging power displaces an existing great power. Thucydides, the Athenian military general and historian who wrote the history of the Peloponnesian War, observed, quote, that it was the rise of Athens and the fear this instilled in Sparta that made war inevitable. It's now become common to ask whether the rise of China makes conflict, military conflict, with America inevitable. It's become even more common to talk about a new Cold War, as if the ideological rivalry between China and the US somehow mirrors that of the US and the Soviet Union. People talk about an economic iron curtain across the globe as Western supply chains and technology systems decouple from China's state-dominated ones. We're also seeing increasingly ugly consequences from the deteriorating relationship. There's growing anti-Chinese sentiment in America and other countries, including Canada. For its part, China uses heavy-handed bullying, from its wolf warrior diplomacy to consumer boycotts and punitive tariffs on countries, organizations, and individuals that criticize China or don't fall into line. As you all know painfully, other countries get stuck in the middle. The shocking detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor is a horrific reminder of the price that two Canadians are paying for the deterioration in the US-China relationship, and for China's conviction that Canada was doing America's bidding and must pay a price for it. Ultimately, though, it's clear that even if the costs of this deterioration are huge, they are likely to get even bigger. That's because this worsening relationship will gradually unpick the fabric of globalization. If you just take this popular analogy of a new Cold War, it is hugely misleading, because the Soviet Union was America's ideological rival, but it was not a commercial rival. Trade flows between America and the USSR were tiny. The Soviet Union was barely attached to the global trading system. China, by contrast, is the world's second biggest economy and a behemoth of global trade. It makes some 22% of global manufacturing exports. It's integrated into literally thousands of supply chains around the world. Breaking these supply chains would come at an exorbitant price. It really would undo globalization as we know it. It would remove the potential for prosperity that being part of the global trading system has brought across the emerging world. Worse, if the world did split in this way, if it did decouple in this way, it's not actually clear how much of it would be on the Western side. Consider this. China is the largest goods trading partner of some 64 countries. America is the largest goods trading partner of some 38 countries. China's Belt and Road Initiative is a concerted effort to draw emerging economies into the Chinese orbit through infrastructure financing. China is a huge market, a huge part of the supply chain, and increasingly a huge source of technology. Some 170 countries use Huawei products. Only a dozen or so have banned it, as the US has been pushing. China isn't winning the battle for hearts and minds in much of the developing world. Its bullying diplomacy is aggressive. It sometimes uses debt aggressively as a weapon. And many developing countries are wary, especially in the backyard of Southeast Asia. They're desperate not to be forced to choose between the two superpowers. But if they are forced to choose, if they were to be forced to choose, it's not clear to me that they would side with Western democracies. But if this decoupling is costly at best, catastrophic at worst, how can it be avoided? How should dueling superpowers, each other's biggest strategic and economic rival, with profoundly different values and ideologies, with zero trust in each other, and yet huge trading partners, and between them pillars of the global economy, how should they deal with each other? The honest answer, The genuinely honest answer is that nobody knows. This has never been done before. There is no historical precedent for where this relationship has to go. At a superficial level, the answer is clear. You need a comprehensive strategic approach, one that enables cooperation where it's needed, whether that's on pandemics or global warming, that fences off areas of strategic competition, such as cutting-edge technology, and that allows for differences over values, such as human rights, to be voiced, and that has clear rules of behavior. There's now a whole cottage industry in scholarly articles laying out the contours of such a strategic relationship. It's one of those things, though, that is easy to say, put the relationship into different buckets. But it's really hard to work out how to do this, and even harder if you look at how the world is actually evolving. And at the risk of turning some fairly gloomy remarks into something even gloomier, let me give you a few, let's say 5 reasons why. First, China's recent direction. Greater authoritarianism, greater assertiveness, continued economic success. That combination is likely to continue. This year, on July 1st, the Communist Party celebrates its centenary. That is a huge anniversary in China. And the party is as strong as it has ever been. Party rule is ever stronger in private companies, and it's ever more effectively fused with a nationalist appeal and technological prowess in a powerful combination. Now, I'm enough of a liberal to believe that a repressive regime can't last forever, and that increasingly heavy-handed approaches in China will eventually cause problems. But there's really no sign of it yet. Equally, President Xi has created an economy that combines market forces and Communist Party oversight, carefully managed openness in some areas. The financial sector is the latest that is gradually being opened up. A vibrant tech sector, but coupled with total control over data and technology. And that combination is proving immensely successful. China's economic outlook is strong, and in technology and data flows, the decoupling is growing because China is pushing it. Second, I also think that the US trajectory looks like it's going to be more of the same. The Biden administration has more experienced diplomats and a less aggressive veneer than the Trump administration. But bashing China is a constant backdrop to American politics, as both parties try to out-hawk the other. The Republicans now clearly see China as a cudgel with which to beat the Democrats. The competition for the moment and for the foreseeable future is to which side can be tougher on China. Third, even if you didn't have toxic politics in the United States, the practicalities of trying to manage a relationship with different issues in different buckets is really hard. Let me just give you a couple of examples. Consider climate, an area where everyone knows that progress depends on China and the United States working together. Well, the rhetoric there is pretty good. President Biden has made climate change a priority. President Xi, just in the past few months, has promised that China's CO2 emissions will peak by 2030 and it will be carbon neutral by 2060. But the most efficient way to get there would be global supply chains. And China is the biggest and cheapest producer of many of the elements in renewable energy supply chains. Unfortunately, almost half of the world's supply of polysilicon, which is a key input into solar panels, is produced in Xinjiang. Climate crashes into human rights. One bucket crashes into another. A more structural problem is that President Biden is selling climate, selling environmental policy in the US as a national security and domestic jobs plan. America, he argues, needs to build solar and renewable power to create American jobs for American workers so that China doesn't control them. Now, that may be a useful political strategy to getting policies through in the US, but it's not clear that it makes cooperation with China on climate any easier. Similarly, the very nature of the technological revolution is going to make it harder to split the relationship between the US and China into buckets. That's because ever more of the economy fits into the tech bucket. Increasingly, as computing power and big data become ever more ubiquitous, ever more goods, washing machine, fridges, milk cartons will be fixed with sensors and joined to a big Internet of Things. Look at cars. They are already really a powerful computer on wheels. In this world, buying goods means buying a stream of digital services from those who make them. It makes them vulnerable to cyber attack. It's hard to buy those goods from a country you fundamentally don't trust. Fourth, we tend to underestimate what the scale of what would be needed to underpin a global system built around two superpowers that have no trust. All of the machinery we currently have, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the American-created machinery of the post-war order, lacks credibility and are out of date for this task. Consider just simply all of the new areas where agreements and standards are needed, cybersecurity to space, data flows to bioethics. We need to build a huge new architecture, and we need to build it with two central players who have no trust for each other. And finally, the West is not really a monolith. There are genuine disagreements among liberal democracies about the right approach. Germany, with a huge export market in China, is much less keen to take tough positions on human rights, as last week's G7 summit attests. Europe considers itself a standard setter on data and tech regulation, but it often seems as worried about America's tech giants as about China. A divided West is clearly less likely to succeed, but these differences are genuine. So the challenges to coming up with a strategic relationship between the two superpowers are serious. We should be clear-eyed about what it will take to develop it. But that doesn't mean it's impossible. And so I want to end by pointing to some glimmers of optimism. First, we really are seeing remarkable innovation in global geopolitical architecture, as more flexible groups are emerging in different areas. The Quad, an informal military cooperation between the US, India, Australia, and Japan, is showing promise. Japan resuscitated the Trans-Pacific Partnership after President Trump pulled America out, now renamed the CPTPP. Trade deals always have incomprehensible acronyms. This new trade deal has significant potential. And there also does seem to be a growing sense of urgency. Though the G7 didn't deliver much relative to the soaring rhetoric of liberal democracies taking on autocracies, it did show signs of progress. Some glimmer of a global agreement on corporate tax. It's possible that the Build Back Better world, which the G7 announced as its counterpart to the Belt and Road Initiative, will actually end up yielding something. America is the indispensable nation for Western leadership. But that doesn't mean the rest of us don't have any role or responsibility. Just as Britain played a big part in building the Bretton Woods system after World War II, so countries other than America and China can shape this 21st century world. And perhaps that's where our politicians need to be infused with the approaches that H McArthur stood for. He clearly would not have given up. He would reject the idea that smaller countries had no agency in this duel with superpowers. He would try to bring people together. In the video that you watched earlier, you heard John say, "What I like doing is fixing things." That is a message that dueling superpowers and our own politicians would do well to hear. Thank you very much.